Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that's pretty fundamental to being human learning. But we're not talking about memorizing facts or anything like that. We're going deeper and exploring how what's going on in our minds interacts with our actions and the world around us to shape how we learn.
It's interesting how for so long people thought of learning as just stimulus and response. Like we were basically machines. You see something, you react, and then the consequences determine if you'll do it again.
Like training a puppy.
Yeah.
Give them a treat when they sit, and eventually they'll sit on command every time.
Hmm.
But our sources make it clear that it's not that simple for humans.
Hmm.
There's a whole internal world of thought that influences things. We're not just responding to rewards and punishments.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting. One of our sources actually talks about this, highlighting Albert Bandura and his social learning theory. He suggested that our thoughts, our behaviors, and the environment around us are constantly interacting and influencing each other. It's not a one-way street, it's dynamic.
So it's not just that our environment shapes us, but we also shape our environment. And our thoughts are in there somewhere too.
Yes, precisely. Bandura actually called this reciprocal determinism. Sounds complicated, but it's a powerful idea. One of our sources gives an example about an autistic boy who acted totally differently depending on which parent was around. With his mom, he was more lenient. He was more likely to have outbursts. But with his dad, who was stricter and always disciplined that behavior, he was totally different.
Wait, so the same kid in the same place, like their house, was like a different person depending on who was there. That's pretty wild.
It is, and it really shows how much context and an individual's perception of that context matters. It even challenges the old idea that personality is fixed. Like, we're not just friendly or shy all the time. Our behavior can totally change based on the situation and how we see it.
This makes me think about how different classrooms or even workplaces might affect how people behave. But if we're not just puppets of our environment, then how much control do we actually have?
Yeah. That's what's great about social learning theory. It acknowledges that we have agency. We're not just reacting to stimuli, we're processing information, making decisions, and shaping our experiences.
Okay, so this reciprocal determinism thing is starting to make sense. But I'm curious, how exactly do our thoughts, that cognitive side of things, come into play? Do we just choose to be influenced by the environment?
Well, one of the main ways our thoughts shape how we learn is through observation. We learn a ton just by watching other people, and that's actually where we'll pick things up in the next part of our deep dive. So we were talking about how much we learn just by watching others. It's crazy how much we pick up without even realizing it.
Yeah, for sure. Just think about how we learn to talk, or even how we figure out how to use social media these days. It's like there's this whole hidden curriculum we learn by watching what everyone else does.
Exactly. And Bandura actually identified a few different ways that this modeling thing works. Like there's live modeling, like when you learn to cook by helping out in the kitchen with your parents or something.
Right, right.
And then there's symbolic modeling, which is like learning from characters in books and movies. Oh, and even video games now.
Ah, symbolic modeling. That's a good one. Makes me think about how I was totally obsessed with this one detective show when I was a kid.
Yeah.
I swear, the way the main character talk and how they solved problems, it really had an impact on me.
Oh, absolutely. And then there's also verbal modeling, which is more like when someone's directly explaining something to you, like teaching you how to play a new board game or something. All these types of modeling, they basically give us information on how to do things and what the consequences might be.
Interesting. But doesn't that kind of go against the idea that we learn mainly from direct consequences? Like if we're just watching, we're not the ones getting the reward or the punishment.
Yeah, that's a good point. But remember, we're talking about the cognitive side of learning here. It's not like we're just mindlessly copying or observing. We're processing that information, and then we're making a choice about what we imitate. And get this, our sources point out that sometimes seeing someone not get punished can be just as influential as seeing them get rewarded.
Really? How so?
Well, imagine you see a coworker getting away with, like, cutting corners on a project. Even though nobody's praising them for it, you still might think, maybe I can do that too, since there wasn't any negative consequence.
Ah, I see what you mean. The fact that there's no punishment, it's like a silent approval kind of thing.
Exactly. And this has some big implications for things like, oh, I don't know, media violence or even unethical behavior at a company. If we see those things happening and there's no consequence, it can subtly change our idea of what's acceptable.
That's a good point. It's like a reminder that even if we don't directly experience the consequences, what we observe can still really shape how we behave. But Obviously, there's more to it than just mimicking. Our own thoughts have to be involved in figuring out what all this stuff we're seeing actually means, right?
Hmm.
Okay, so we've talked about how watching other people influences the way we learn, but obviously it's not as simple as just copying what we see. Our brains are in there trying to make sense of it all, like building some kind of internal model of how the world works.
Right. And the fascinating thing is that we're not just passively absorbing information. We're processing it, we're categorizing it, and we're storing it away using these mental models.
Mental models, okay. Help me out here. What exactly are we talking about?
Well, you can think of them kind of like mental maps that we use to navigate the world. Each map is like our understanding of a certain concept or situation, and they're built up from our experiences and what we observe.
Mental maps. That makes me think about how two people could see the same event, but interpret it totally differently because of their past experiences. Is that kind of what you mean?
Exactly. Our mental models act like filters. They influence how we see new information and how we make decisions based on it. And one of the ways that we build these models is through something called symbolic representation. It's basically how we learn to use symbols, things like words, numbers, images, to represent real things in the world.
Oh, so like learning math. We start with real objects, but eventually we're just working with numbers in our heads. We don't need those objects anymore.
Right. And as we create these mental models, they can sometimes lead to some pretty unexpected outcomes. One of our sources talked about a study where people were getting rewards based on a certain schedule, but some of them were told the wrong thing about how that schedule worked.
And what happened?
It turned out that even though everyone was actually experiencing the same consequences, how they behaved changed based on what they believed about the reward system. The ones who thought they were getting rewarded often acted differently than those who thought rewards were rare. But in reality, it was the same for both groups.
Wow, that's really interesting. So basically, what we believe about the world can actually be more powerful than what we actually experience. But if our beliefs are that strong, can we change them? Can we like reshape those mental maps to make ourselves better learners?
That's where self-regulation comes in. It's about having the ability to manage our own learning and behavior. It's like having an inner coach who helps us set goals and stay motivated, even track our progress.
So it's not just about the external rewards and punishments then. We can actually set our own standards and motivate ourselves.
Exactly. Think about how good it feels to finish something challenging, even if nobody else knows about it. Or that guilty feeling you get when you put something off that you know you should be doing. That's self-regulation in action.
So we basically internalize the values and expectations that we learned from other people, and then we apply those to ourselves. But does that mean we're stuck with those early influences forever?
Not at all. Actually, one of our sources described a study where some kids saw adults modeling really high standards for self-reward. And you know what? Later on, when those kids were by themselves, they still held themselves to those same standards. It shows you how strong modeling can be, but also that we can actually learn new ways of self-regulating throughout our lives.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of learning. We've seen that it's way more than just stimulus and response. It's this complex interaction between what we're thinking, what we're doing, and the environment we're in. We're observing, building mental models, and even learning how to regulate ourselves.
And the biggest takeaway here is that understanding these different factors gives you a lot of power. You can be more aware of these processes and create environments that really help you learn, challenge your existing beliefs, and ultimately shape your own growth.
So here's something to think about. If what you believe shapes your reality, what kind of mental maps do you want to be creating? How can you use this idea of self-regulation to reach your goals and become the best learner you can be? Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep those mental gears turning. Thanks for joining us.